They had been told their tanks were adequate. The Type 97 Kihar medium tank, with its 57mm gun and respectable armor, had served the Imperial Japanese Army well enough in China, where it dominated battlefields against opponents who possessed little anti-tank capability. Japanese tank crews had been trained to believe their equipment represented a reasonable balance of firepower, protection, and mobility. They trusted the engineers who designed these machines. They trusted the officers who assured them they could fight effectively. On the morning of January 23, 1945, near the town of San Manuel in the Philippines, that trust began to fracture in ways that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The 2nd Tank Division had positioned several Type 97 tanks in hull-down positions along a ridgeline overlooking the approach routes American forces would need to use. The commanders had chosen their ground carefully. The tanks were partially concealed, with only their turrets exposed, making them difficult targets. The crews had loaded armor-piercing ammunition for their main guns. They had coordinated fields of fire with adjacent positions. By all the tactical principles they had been taught, they were prepared for the coming engagement. Then the American tanks appeared, and something was different about them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. These were not the Sherman tanks Japanese crews had encountered before, the ones with the short-barreled 75mm guns that fired a relatively low-velocity round. These new vehicles had longer barrels, noticeably longer, extending well beyond the turret front. The Japanese tank commanders, watching through their crude periscopes, did not yet understand what they were seeing. They did not know that the United States Army had begun fielding an upgraded version of the Sherman, designated the M4A3E8, mounting a new high-velocity 76mm gun. They did not know that this weapon represented a fundamental shift in the balance of armored combat in the Pacific theater. The first Japanese tank to fire achieved what should have been a good hit. The Type 97's 57mm armor-piercing round struck a Sherman's frontal armor at a range of approximately 600 meters. The Japanese crew watched through their optics, expecting to see the American tank disabled or at least forced to withdraw. Instead, the round deflected off the angled armor plating, leaving only a bright scar on the metal surface. The Sherman's turret traversed smoothly, mechanically, with the kind of powered precision Japanese tanks could never match. Then it fired. The sound was different from anything the Japanese crews had heard before. Not the sharp crack of a 75mm Sherman gun, but something deeper, more powerful, a sound that carried the weight of greater kinetic energy being released. The armor-piercing round from the 76mm gun crossed the distance in a fraction of a second. It struck the Type 97's frontal turret armor, which had been designed to resist the older Sherman's gun at that range. The shell did not deflect. It did not ricochet. It punched through the armor plate as if it were little more than sheet metal, penetrating completely and continuing into the fighting compartment with all its remaining energy. Inside the Japanese tank, the crew experienced a moment of absolute incomprehension before the secondary effects of penetration killed or wounded them. The shell had not just gone through the armor. It had done so with such overwhelming force that there was no question of the armor providing any meaningful protection. The fundamental premise of their defensive position, that their tank's armor would protect them while they engaged enemy vehicles, had been invalidated in a single shot. The Type 97 Kihar represented the best medium tank Imperial Japan could produce in meaningful numbers during the Second World War. Its development had begun in the mid-1930s, at a time when Japanese military planners were reassessing their armored doctrine following experiences in Manchuria and China. The Type 89 medium tank, Japan's first mass-produced tank, had proven too slow for the kind of mobile warfare the army envisioned. Its maximum speed of 15 miles per hour was adequate for close infantry support, but inadequate for exploitation and pursuit operations across the vast distances of mainland Asia. The Army Technical Bureau issued specifications for a new medium tank in 1936. The design requirements reflected Japanese strategic priorities and industrial limitations. The tank would weigh approximately 15 tons, significantly heavier than the Type 95 Hargo light tank, but still light enough for Japan's infrastructure to support. It would mount a 57mm gun, providing better anti-armor capability than the 37mm weapons on light tanks. It would achieve speeds of up to 25 miles per hour, allowing it to keep pace with motorized infantry columns. And critically, it would be simple enough that Japanese industry could manufacture it in quantities sufficient to equip multiple tank divisions. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries received the contract and delivered the first prototype in 1937. The vehicle that emerged from their design bureaus was, by the standards of the time, a competent medium tank. It measured 5.5 meters long, 2.3 meters wide, and 2.4 meters tall. The armor protection ranged from 8 mm on the thinnest sections to 25 mm on the turret front, with most of the hull protected by 25 mm plates on the front and sides. This was calculated to resist standard rifle-caliber armor-piercing ammunition and provide some protection against light anti-tank weapons. The main armament, the Type 975 7mm tank gun, could fire both high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds. The armor-piercing projectile could penetrate approximately 55 mm of vertical armor plate at 500 meters under ideal conditions. Against the Chinese forces Japan primarily fought in the late 1930s, this was more than adequate. Chinese armies possessed few tanks and limited anti-tank guns. The Type 97 dominated these battlefields, providing mobile firepower that Chinese forces could not match or effectively counter. The tank's engine was a Mitsubishi Type 97 12-cylinder air-cooled diesel producing 170 horsepower. The diesel fuel system offered advantages in terms of fire safety and fuel availability within Japan's empire. The suspension used a bell crank design similar to that pioneered on the Type 95 light tank, providing reasonable cross-country mobility. The crew consisted of 4 men, a driver and hull machine gunner in the front, a commander and gunner in the turret. This was one more crew member than the Type 95, reflecting the Type 97's status as a medium tank requiring dedicated gunner and commander positions. Production began in 1938, and the Type 97 entered service with Japanese tank regiments deploying to China. There, it performed exactly as its designers had intended. It was mobile enough for pursuit operations, powerful enough to destroy field fortifications and support infantry assaults, and reliable enough to operate across the difficult terrain and long supply lines of the Chinese theater. Japanese tank crews gained experience and confidence. They learned their trade against an enemy who could rarely fight back effectively against armor. This success created a dangerous psychological foundation. The crews and their commanders came to believe the Type 97 was a genuinely capable tank rather than a vehicle optimized for a specific, limited scenario. They had no frame of reference for what modern tank versus tank combat against a peer adversary would actually entail. Their entire combat experience consisted of engagements where they possessed overwhelming advantages in mobility, protection, and firepower. The tank that seemed so effective in China was about to face an entirely different kind of warfare, and its crews were about to discover truths that their training and experience had left them completely unprepared to accept. The 2nd Tank Division represented one of Imperial Japan's most significant armored formations, committed to the defense of the Philippines in the final year of the war. Organized in Manchuria in 1944, the division was equipped primarily with Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, along with some Type 95 Hago light tanks and a small number of the improved Type 97 Shinhoto Chiha, which mounted a more powerful 47mm high-velocity gun. The division's tank crews were a mixture of veterans from the China campaigns and newer recruits who had trained in Manchuria and Korea. These men had been taught a specific Payne's doctrine of armored warfare. Japanese tank tactics emphasized aggressive action, surprise, and the moral superiority of Japanese fighting spirit. Training manuals stressed that proper tactical employment could overcome material disadvantages. Crews were instructed to use terrain for concealment, to engage from hull-down positions whenever possible, and to coordinate with infantry and artillery. The Type 97's armor, they were told, was sufficient to resist most enemy anti-tank weapons at combat ranges, provided the crew positioned the tank properly and avoided exposing weak points unnecessarily. The technical specifications of the Type 97 had been explained to crews during their training. The frontal turret armor was 25 mm thick, angled slightly to improve resistance against incoming projectiles. The hull front was also protected by 25 mm plates. The side armor was 25 mm as well, unusual for a tank design where sides were typically thinner than the front. This uniform armor distribution reflected Japanese tactical thinking that tanks might need to maneuver in close terrain, where flanking fire was a constant threat. Crews were taught that this armor protection was adequate for the threats they would face. The calculations were straightforward. American M3 and early M4 Sherman tanks mounted 75 mm guns, firing armor-piercing rounds with a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,000 feet per second. At ranges beyond 500 meters, these rounds would struggle to penetrate the Type 97's frontal armor, especially if the Japanese tank was positioned hull down or at an angle. Japanese armor doctrine assumed that engagements would occur at these ranges, where both sides would have roughly equivalent chances of achieving penetrating hits. The actual combat experience in China had reinforced these assumptions. Chinese forces rarely had tanks, and their anti-tank guns were limited to older models with modest penetration capabilities. When Type 97 tanks did face anti-tank fire, the armor generally held. Crews learned to trust their protection. They learned that if they followed proper tactics, their tank would keep them alive while they delivered fire against the enemy. This psychological foundation, built on years of experience, was about to be demolished by a weapon system they did not know existed. The Sherman M4A3E8, which American tankers called the Easy 8, represented a significant upgrade to the standard Sherman design. The most important change was the replacement of the 75 mm M3 gun with the 76 mm M1A2 gun. This new weapon had been developed in response to encounters with German armor in Europe, where the standard Sherman's gun had proven inadequate against Tiger and Panther tanks. The 76 mm gun fired a substantially more powerful round. The M62 armor-piercing capped ballistic cap round, standard ammunition for the 76 mm gun, had a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second, significantly higher than the older 75 mm round. More importantly, the projectile was heavier and had better armor penetration characteristics. At 500 meters, the 76 mm gun could penetrate approximately 109 mm of vertical armor plate. At 1,000 meters, it could still penetrate 92 mm. These were not theoretical numbers. They were verified through extensive testing at American ordnance proving grounds. The mathematics of armor penetration are unforgiving. The Type 97's 25 mm frontal armor, which had been calculated to resist the 75 mm Sherman gun at combat ranges, was utterly inadequate against the 76 mm weapon. The new gun could penetrate the Type 97's armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, far beyond the distances at which the Japanese 57 mm gun could effectively engage a Sherman. Japanese tank designers had not anticipated this development because they had no intelligence suggesting the Americans were fielding a more powerful tank gun in the Pacific theater. The first M4A3E8 tanks arrived in the Philippines in late 1944, issued to select units of the 1st Cavalry Division and other formations preparing for the Luzon campaign. American tank crews were pleased with the upgrade. The longer 76 mm gun gave them confidence they could defeat any Japanese armor they might encounter. The improved horizontal volute spring suspension system, which gave the tank its Easy 8 nickname, provided better cross-country mobility and a more stable firing platform. The tank also featured wider tracks that reduced ground pressure and improved performance in soft terrain. When Japanese scouts first reported seeing Shermans with longer gun barrels, the information was noted but not properly analyzed. Japanese intelligence officers had no context for understanding what the longer barrel meant. Some speculated it might be a different model of the 75 mm gun. Others thought it might be a specialized variant for a specific tactical role. No one in the Japanese chain of command understood that the Americans had fundamentally upgraded their tank armament with a weapon that completely outclassed anything in the Japanese arsenal. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The engagements near San Manuel in late January 1945 provided the clearest demonstration of the disparity between the Type 97 and the upgunned Sherman. The 2nd Tank Division had positioned its tanks to defend critical road junctions and terrain features along the American axis of advance. The defensive positions were well chosen, utilizing natural terrain to provide concealment and fields of fire. Japanese tank commanders could see the approaching American columns from elevated positions, allowing them to prepare for engagement. The American advance included several M4A3E8 tanks operating, with infantry and artillery support. The American commanders were not expecting significant resistance from Japanese armor, based on previous encounters where Shermans had easily dominated Type 95 light tanks and older Type 97 seconds. But they approached the Japanese positions carefully, using reconnaissance elements and indirect fire to suppress suspected defensive positions before committing tanks to the advance. The first exchange of fire occurred at approximately 8:30 inches the morning. A Type 97 inches, a hull-down position fired at an advancing Sherman from a range estimated at 700 meters. The Japanese gunner had aimed carefully, leading the target and adjusting for the slight elevation difference. The 57mm armor-piercing round struck the Sherman's frontal glacis plate, the angled armor protecting the front of the hull. The impact created a bright flash and a shower of sparks. The Japanese crew, watching through their optics, expected to see the Sherman stop, perhaps with smoke, indicating internal damage. Instead, the Sherman barely slowed. The round had struck at an oblique angle against the glacis plate, which was 51mm thick and angled at 56 degrees from vertical. The effective armor thickness against the incoming projectile was considerably greater than the actual plate thickness due to this angle. The 57mm round, already at the limits of its penetration capability at that range, deflected upward and away from the hull. The Sherman's commander immediately identified the source of the fire and directed his gunner onto the target. The 76mm gun fired. The Japanese tank commander saw the muzzle flash and then, less than a second later, felt an impact that was entirely different from anything in his experience. The armor-piercing round struck the Type 97's turret front, slightly to the right of the main gun. The 25mm armor plate offered no meaningful resistance. The projectile punched through cleanly, its tungsten core, maintaining structural integrity as it penetrated. Inside the turret, the shell continued through the fighting compartment, striking the gunner and continuing through the rear turret armor before exiting the vehicle. The commander, standing to the left of where the round penetrated, survived the initial impact but was showered with fragments of armor, spalling and debris. The gunner died instantly. The loader, positioned lower in the turret, was wounded by secondary fragments. The driver and hull machine gunner, separated from the turret by the turret basket floor, were initially unharmed, but immediately recognized that their tank had been catastrophically penetrated. The commander, his hearing damaged by the overpressure of the shell passing through the confined space, could not immediately process what had happened. The surviving crew members of that first penetrated Type 97 abandoned their tank within seconds of the hit. The commander, disoriented and partially deafened, pulled himself out of the turret hatch. The driver and hull machine gunner evacuated through their front hatches, moving with the trained urgency of men who knew their vehicle could explode at any moment from ammunition fires or fuel ignition. They ran toward a tree line approximately 50 meters behind their position, expecting machine gun fire from American infantry to cut them down. Instead, the American tanks held their fire, allowing the crew to escape. This was not mercy in any sentimental sense. American tank commanders had learned that allowing Japanese crews to abandon disabled vehicles reduced the likelihood of suicidal resistance and provided intelligence opportunities if the men were later captured. Other Type 97 tanks in the defensive line watched this engagement unfold. Several commanders reported the penetration to their unit leader via the few radios available. The reports were confused, emphasizing that the American tank had fired from beyond normal engagement range and achieved a clean penetration of frontal armor. The unit commander, a major who had fought in China since 1937, initially dismissed these reports as exaggeration or the result of a lucky hit against a weak point in the armor. He ordered the remaining tanks to hold their positions and engage American armor as opportunities presented themselves. Over the next 3 hours, 7 more Type 97 tanks were destroyed by 76mm gunfire. Each engagement followed a similar pattern. Japanese tanks would fire first, often achieving hits against American Shermans that either deflected or caused only superficial damage. The American tanks would return fire with their more powerful guns, and the Japanese tanks would be penetrated, usually on the first or second shot. Crews that survived the initial penetration abandoned their vehicles. Those trapped inside burned to death as ammunition or fuel ignited. By early afternoon, the Japanese defensive position had collapsed, not through tactical failure, but through the simple fact that their equipment could not survive against the weapons facing them. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese tank crews was profound and immediate. These were not inexperienced recruits. Many had multiple years of combat service. They had been trained to trust their equipment and their tactics. They understood intellectually that American industrial capacity was greater than Japan's, but they had believed that proper tactical employment could compensate for material disadvantages. The engagements near San Manuel demonstrated that this belief was false. No amount of tactical skill, no clever positioning, no aggressive spirit could overcome the fundamental reality that their armor could not protect them and their guns could not effectively harm the enemy. Post-battle interrogations of captured Japanese tank crew members, conducted by American intelligence officers in the weeks following these engagements, revealed consistent themes. The prisoners expressed shock at the penetrating power of the American guns. Several stated they had believed their frontal armor was adequate against Sherman tanks based on their training and previous combat experience. One sergeant, who had served as a gunner since 1939, told interrogators that he felt betrayed by his own leadership. He had been assured the Type 97 was adequate for the mission. He had trained his crew based on tactical doctrines that assumed rough parity in armored combat. Those doctrines had proven catastrophically wrong. Another captured crew member, a corporal who had been a loader in a Type 97, described the moment of penetration in detail that American intelligence officers found valuable for understanding the effects of anti-tank rounds on crew psychology. He stated that the sound of the impact was different from anything he had experienced. Previous hits from smaller weapons had created loud bangs against the exterior armor but had not penetrated. The 76mm round made a different sound. A sharp crack followed immediately by the scream of metal being torn and the specific noise of the projectile passing through the fighting compartment. He said he knew instantly, before even seeing the damage, that the armor had been defeated. The psychological effect was more devastating than the physical danger because it destroyed his fundamental sense of protection. The battles in the Philippines continued through February and March of 1945, and the pattern established near San Manuel repeated across the islands. Japanese tank units, when they engaged American armor, were consistently outmatched. The introduction of the 76mm gun, Sherman had shifted the already unfavorable balance of armored combat even further against Japanese forces. American tank crews, who had previously approached Japanese armor with caution, despite their advantages, now engaged with confidence bordering on contempt. They knew their guns could penetrate Japanese tanks at ranges where return fire was ineffective. They knew their armor could resist Japanese anti-tank weapons at combat distances. Japanese commanders attempted to adapt their tactics to account for the new American gun. Some units began using tanks primarily as stationary pillboxes, dug into prepared positions where only the turret was exposed. This reduced their vulnerability somewhat by limiting the target area and providing additional protection from the surrounding earth. But it also eliminated the mobility that was supposed to be the Type 97's advantage. A tank dug into a static position was effectively a poorly designed bunker, sacrificing the ability to maneuver for marginal improvements in protection that still proved inadequate against 76mm fire. Other units attempted to conduct night attacks, reasoning that darkness would reduce the American tank's ability to engage accurately at long range and force close-range engagements, where Japanese numbers and aggressive tactics might prevail. These attacks occasionally achieved tactical surprise, but consistently resulted in heavy losses. American forces had infantry support weapons, including bazookas and 57mm anti-tank guns, that were effective against Japanese armor at close range. More importantly, American tanks were equipped with better vision devices and could coordinate with infantry through radio communications that Japanese forces lacked. Night attacks by Japanese armor became predictable sacrifices that accomplished little beyond adding more destroyed hulls to the battlefield. The industrial and strategic context made the situation even more hopeless. By early 1945, Japanese tank production had effectively ceased. The factories that had built Type 97 seconds were either destroyed by American bombing, retooled for other priorities, or starved of raw materials by the American submarine blockade that had severed Japan's access to resources in Southeast Asia. Even if Japanese engineers had designed a tank capable of matching the 76mm Sherman, which they had not, there was no industrial capacity to produce it in meaningful numbers. The Type 3 Chinook, mounting a 75mm gun derived from an anti-aircraft weapon, existed in prototype form and limited production runs. Approximately 160 were built, and none were sent to combat theaters. They were held in reserve for the defense of the Japanese home islands against the anticipated American invasion. Meanwhile, American factories were producing Sherman tanks at rates that defied Japanese comprehension. The Fisher tank arsenal alone could produce over 1,000 tanks per month at peak capacity. Multiple facilities across the United States were manufacturing Shermans, along with all the supporting equipment, ammunition, spare parts, and logistics infrastructure necessary to maintain armored units in combat across two oceans. The scale of American industrial mobilization was so vast that it appeared almost abstract to Japanese officers studying intelligence reports. The numbers seemed impossible, yet the evidence kept appearing on battlefields across the Pacific. For the Japanese tank crews who survived the Philippines campaign, and for those stationed on Okinawa and other islands awaiting the American advance, the knowledge of their equipment's inadequacy created a specific kind of psychological burden. They knew they were expected to fight. They knew their tanks offered no real protection. They knew their weapons were ineffective against American armor. Yet military discipline and the cultural expectations of service demanded they continue performing their duties. Some crews attempted to improve their chances through improvisation, adding extra armor plates scavenged from destroyed vehicles or sandbags around vulnerable points. These modifications added weight that the already underpowered tanks could barely handle and provided minimal additional protection against weapons that were already over-penetrating the original armor. The final major commitment of Japanese armor in the Pacific War occurred during the defense of Okinawa in April through June of 1945. The 27th Tank Regiment defended the island with a mixed force of Type 95 light tanks and Type 97 medium tanks. American forces landed with over 800 tanks, including many M4A3E8 variants with 76mm guns. The numerical disparity was approximately 30-1. The qualitative disparity was even greater. Japanese tank attacks, when they occurred, were destroyed within hours, with minimal American losses. The tanks that survived initial engagements were hunted down methodically by American armor and infantry working in coordination. One engagement on Okinawa, documented in American after-action reports, illustrated the hopelessness of Japanese armored operations in the war's final months. A platoon of 4 Type 97 tanks attempted a dawn attack against American positions near the town of Shuri. The tanks advanced across open ground, hoping to reach American lines before being engaged. American observers spotted them immediately and called for tank support. 2 M4A3E8 Shermans moved into position and engaged the Japanese tanks at a range of approximately 1,200 meters. All 4 Type 97 seconds were destroyed within 6 minutes. The American tanks fired a total of 11 rounds, achieving 7 hits. 4 penetrations resulted in immediate catastrophic kills. The Japanese crews had no opportunity to return effective fire. American tankers reported the engagement as routine, noting only that the Japanese tanks appeared to be operated by inexperienced crews based on their movement patterns and formation spacing. The truth was more complex. The Japanese crews were not necessarily inexperienced. They were operating equipment that was obsolete by nearly a decade of combat development and facing opponents with overwhelming material advantages. Experience and training could not compensate for fundamental disparities in armor, protection, gun performance, and supporting infrastructure. The tank crews who died in that engagement near Shuri and in dozens of similar engagements across the Pacific in the war's final year were not defeated by superior American tactics or courage. They were defeated by the industrial and technological gap between two nations at war, a gap that had widened steadily since 1941 and had become unbridgeable by 1945. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, surviving Type 97 tanks in the home islands were examined by American occupation forces and technical intelligence teams. Engineers measured armor thickness, tested metallurgy, evaluated mechanical systems, and documented design features. Their reports confirmed what combat had already demonstrated. The Type 97 was a competent tank by mid-1930s standards, adequate for colonial warfare and counterinsurgency operations, utterly inadequate for modern industrialized combat against a peer adversary. The armor that Japanese crews had trusted was barely sufficient to stop heavy machine gun fire, let alone dedicated anti-tank weapons. The American technical intelligence officers who examined these tanks after the war wrote detailed assessments that went beyond mere technical specifications. They analyzed the design philosophy that had produced the Type 97, noting the emphasis on simplicity, ease of manufacture, and adequacy for specific mission profiles rather than performance maximization. They observed that Japanese tank design had essentially frozen in the late 1930s, with only minor incremental improvements made during the war years. In contrast, American, British, German, and Soviet tank designs had evolved rapidly through continuous combat feedback and industrial innovation. By 1945, the Type 97 was fighting a war it had never been designed for, using technology that was obsolete before the Pacific War began. The story of Japanese tank crews facing Sherman 76mm guns represents more than a simple tale of technological mismatch. It reveals the human cost of strategic decisions made years before the battles were fought. When Japanese military planners in the 1930s designed their armored forces, they optimized for the wars they expected to fight, against opponents they expected to face, with the industrial capacity they possessed. Those decisions were not irrational given the information available at the time. But when circumstances changed, when Japan found itself at war with the United States, those earlier decisions became death sentences for the men who climbed into Type 97 tanks and advanced against enemies their equipment could not defeat. The tank crews, who could not believe the 76mm rounds penetrated their frontal armor, were experiencing the collision between expectation and reality that defined Japan's war experience. They had been told their equipment was adequate. They had trained with doctrine that assumed rough parity with potential adversaries. They had, in many cases, years of combat experience that reinforced these beliefs. Then they encountered a weapons system that rendered all their training, experience, and tactical skill irrelevant. The armor that was supposed to protect them offered no protection. The gun that was supposed to allow them to fight back was ineffective. They were expected to continue fighting anyway, to accept their deaths as necessary sacrifices, even though they now understood those deaths would accomplish nothing beyond briefly delaying an inevitable outcome. This knowledge, the awareness of futility combined with the obligation to continue, created a psychological burden that combat stress alone cannot explain. It was the burden of recognizing that the system which they served, which demanded their loyalty and their lives, had failed in its most basic obligation to provide them with adequate tools for the mission assigned. The Japanese tank crews of 1945 knew they were obsolete. They knew their tanks were obsolete. They knew they would die in those tanks without accomplishing any meaningful military objective. And they climbed into those tanks anyway because duty demanded it, because culture expected it, because there was no alternative available to them within the structure of military obligation and national service. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.